So tell me what got you started on the board policy transformation road. What issues did you set out to address? John, you want to take this?
Sure. It's a great question. To understand that question and my involvement, it may take me to back up for a quick second. Our daughter graduated from Ithaca High School in 2006, and in 2005, Ithaca was listed in Newsweek magazine as one of the top school districts in the country. That same year, the graduation rate for the 2004 cohort was 53% for black and brown students. And so part of my involvement was trying to figure out how we can be listed as one of the best school districts in the nation, and yet my child, our daughter, had a 50-50 chance of graduating. It just didn't seem to make sense to me. And so I happened to be in graduate school at Cornell University at that point in time in policy analysis and management, and chose to focus my dissertation research on exploring what does that mean to work in a school district of excellence, but still struggling to graduate particular segments of our student population. And so my dissertation was called Always Room at the Top, Black Students in Educational Policy in Ithaca, New York. And it was really an attempt at an in-depth look to see what policies may be preventing and or providing roadblocks for students to successfully complete our phenomenal education that we offer here in this community. Luvelle, you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, and in 2010, late 2010, I was in Virginia. Had been born and raised in Charlottesville, Virginia, had worked there, had went to the University of Virginia, and planned to be there throughout my career. But was hearing about a Board of Education in New York, the state of New York, that was looking to transform public education. And I'd heard that there was a Board of Education in place that was committed to doing so, and doing so through policy. That was an attractor, and then after several conversations with the Board of Education, including Sean at the time, I decided to transition and bring my family to this great state and this great district. And that began a strategic planning process for us, where we started with policy number one, which was about the vision and mission for the school district. Mm-hmm. So after hundreds of conversations in our community about strategic planning and what we wanted to create in our school district and in our community and how we would get there, we landed on a new vision and mission. The vision was 6,000 plus thinkers, which represented our young people in our community. And to do that vision, to create that vision, we had to do something, which was our mission. And the mission is to engage, educate, and empower. And that started us on our way from policy number 1 and 2 around vision and mission. We then looked to rewrite a policy manual.
So tell me a bit more about the process you followed. Let's get into some of the nuts and bolts of what we're calling the policy transformation initiative. Who was involved in this? What were the major steps that you went through? Give us a primer on process, if you will.
Sure. Well, I can begin there. I decided to run for the board in 2008 after I completed my dissertation research and felt I should, similar to what Luvelle said, you should take some of these great ideas and theories and put them into action. So to have spent the past 7 or 8 years doing an in-depth research study of this community, it only felt that I should be active in a different way and decided to run for the board. At that point in time, our district did not even have a policy committee. If you looked at our policy manual, there are policies that were last discussed or modified or approved or adopted in 1960s, some even in 1950s. Right, absolutely. And not to say that we couldn't have good thinking that could last those 50 years, but clearly students had changed, teaching had changed, our buildings had changed, and so we needed to do something different. So the first thing we did was actually create a policy committee. It seems like it's basic, but it actually was a pretty revolutionary step for us that gave us a format that was public, that was transparent, and that was organized for us to begin thinking, similar to what Dr. Brown said, a step-by-step process of looking at policy number 1 and going through and looking at every single policy. We're not all the way through at this point in time, but we started looking at every single policy to see what that could look like. That included bringing board members into committee meetings, obviously, but also making sure that we had parents, teachers, students, community experts, et cetera, who would help us inform the dialogues and the conversations, and hopefully to rewrite policies that were much more modern to today's time and student, but more importantly for me, far more inclusive and transformative.
Now, you put together a formal committee. What was the composition of that committee?
The formal committee was simply an extension of the school district board of education. So it was a formalized board of education committee. But within that, we wanted to make sure we were transparent, so we tried to extend those invitations whenever we were talking about a particular policy to as many community folks, teachers, parents, students, et cetera, as possible.
So there was the core committee, which was the board of education. And then
Absolutely.
depending on the particular policy you were looking at, you invited a wider group of participants.
Absolutely, and that work was yes, absolutely, and that work was informed by the arrival of Dr. Brown to our district as well, who came with a much more inviting approach to the work that he does as superintendent. And so one of the things that he instituted when we started doing committee work was doing work sessions, and I can let Dr. Brown speak to those.
Okay.
Yes, and our Board of Education has said from day one that this process needed to be inclusive, culturally responsive, and loving. And that's a belief system of mine as well. So from day one, we sought to bring folks together, a diverse group of people, in a trusting, loving environment. And those community conversations and work sessions, we moved from, we meet 2 times per month, informal meetings. Those business sessions, as they were traditionally called, switched to 1 business session and 1 work session. And the work session, we changed everything, including the makeup of the room. We would put the tables in a square or a circle, and we would have students and teachers at the table with board members for a facilitated conversation about a particular policy shift or an initiative. Again, very inclusive, diverse group of people. It was culturally responsive, and it was loving. Much conversation, a lot of trust at the table, a lot of transparency. And we call those community conversations, i.e. work sessions, led by the board.
So how long, when did the process start, and how far into it are you? Put a framework, chronological framework, if you will. When did you get started, and where are you?
We got started in earnest in 2010, 2011. Before then, we were sort of revamping and adapting and altering policy sort of on a piecemeal basis, but it wasn't something that was formalized. It wasn't until about 2011, 2012 that we began doing a much more formal process.
And Dr. Everly Bradwell says it often. This is at least a 10-year process. So for the folks who are listening, who think they can transform policy and culture and structures in a year or 2, or in the first contract for the superintendent, you're wrong. This is a multi-year project, and it's required a significant amount of commitment from the board and superintendent and staff and community to work together through the good and the bad, through the ups and the downs.
Absolutely.
So you're still engaged in the process. You're coming, though you see the light at the end of the tunnel. I assume you're 6 or 7 years into it, or 7 or 8 years into it.
Absolutely. If you look at most district policy manuals, so for example, our policy manual has over 250 policies. That includes things like union contracts. It includes the student code of conduct. It includes special education procedures, appeal and selection of curriculum, attendance zoning. We can go on and on and on. Each one of those policies requires significant amounts of time and conversation to think about making any sort of change, particularly if you're trying to do a revolutionary change or a transformative change. So if you think about trying to engage in 25 of those conversations per year that are multi-month processes, it's not like one meeting and we're done. We have a meeting, we have another conversation, we write a draft, we review the draft, we talk about the draft, we debate the draft, we rewrite the draft, we pass a first reading. If I'm just giving you a sense of how the process goes, that if you do 25 of those a year, that's a pretty hefty amount of lifting for a volunteer school board to engage in. And so if you have 250 of those to go through in an entire policy book, to do it well, to do it, as Dr. Brown says, to do it with love, to pay attention to language, it takes a great deal of effort and time. And so we have been actively involved in this process for 5 or 6 years, but we can definitely see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're definitely on the other side, and we're very proud of the work we've done so far.
Great. Now, before we get into the content of some of the higher stakes policy changes you've made, going through this process, have there been any major challenges you've had to grapple with? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, we are, and I say this often, and the board has supported me in saying so. I am the leader of an institutionally racist, classist, and sexist organization. With that being said, that presents us with challenges. We need to change policy, structure, systems in order to not be racist and classist and sexist. And that's going to require a significant amount of self-reflection on the parts of every individual associated with our school district. How have I contributed to the institutional racism and classism that exists here? How have I been complicit? How have I written policy or supported those structures? That's each one of us, and including I, who am the leader of one, we've had to self-reflect. And so every meeting we have now, every professional development opportunity, embedded in our curriculum, we have opportunities in very specific language about how to self-reflect on the principles of love and on this institution that we've all been a part of. Now, that has made folks uncomfortable. A lot of folks have not wanted to do it, but the folks who've committed to that have transformed their thinking and in turn helped us transform policy, which has led to the second thing, which is conflict. In education, we as educators are conflict averse. So to engage in conversations and ask questions and push one another on our thinking and, more importantly, our blind spots creates conflict. Unfortunately, here in New York State, and I would argue in a lot of places in our country right now, the conflict that educators are engaged in oftentimes is around evaluations and the differences between effective and highly effective. That's what we've seen as a conflict in our state right now, having that conversation, instead of how we as an organization are racist, how we as an organization have supported classist policies or sexist policies. And that's out there for everyone to see, and it's in our data, it's in our classroom enrollment patterns, it's in the folks in which we hire and recruit and retain, but we rarely talk about it. So here, after the self-reflection and coming to a common understanding about the issues that we must tackle, we're engaging in tough dialogue, led, fortunately in this community, by community members and board members, which allows staff members like myself to have this kind of conversation. And then it gets to, and that third piece is, and then it's getting to policy. So we can self-reflect, we can engage in loving and cooperative, collaborative conflict, but then ultimately it comes down to changing language in a policy manual. In some cases, hasn't been updated since the Jim Crow era. And so that's been tough for us when you actually have to put in writing how we will be more inclusive, how, and we'll get to some of those specific examples in a minute, how we are going to support all young people, how our classrooms are going to be completely inclusive and loving. That pushes folks' thinking, and particularly in one of the smartest towns and cities in America, an academic town that's known internationally, that's done very, very well for a long, long time, to say we're going to change policies that have been on the books since our great school district was put in place has been a challenge. So I hope I gave you some sense of how challenging it is, Sean. I don't know if you've seen or would add something to that.
Well, I'm seeing a picture of some fairly tense discussions.
Absolutely.
At one point or another, I would imagine, a high level of emotion even, right, that you've had to work through. Sean, you were going to add to this, I think.
No, well, I think you captured part of it as well, Doug. It's fantastic. One, we're talking about people's babies, right? It's their most prized possessions. And the things that we're willing to do for our most prized possessions, many of us know in different communities. And so Doc does a good point of talking about reflection and the amount of conflict. The other thing I would add, again, is time. And it's a community that is highly informed and highly involved. One of the great things about our community, and I'm sure all communities, is that people take education seriously and therefore want their voice to be heard. And so we've had to try to find ways to engage in those difficult conversations and not stop them, right, or not cut them short, but actually create spaces for people to put them on the table and say, okay, what can we do with this and how is it going to make us better? And so it's taken a lot of facilitation from not just the board and not just from our teachers and from our administrators and our superintendent, but from our community members to realize that we have everyone's best interest in mind and how can we make this happen for the betterment of our entire community.
Now, you know, this process has a kind of monumental feel, and I'm sure that there are many people listening to this podcast who are probably asking themselves, gee, how much time do you have to commit to this? So over the period of these 6 or so years you've been working on this, what has the time commitment been? Is it possible to speak to an average number of hours per month or something like that? What has it demanded?
Well, first I could say that I have incredible pride in my fellow school members all across the nation that as volunteers we give a significant amount of time, right? And so someone was asking me the other day, and I think I average between 10 to 15 and some weeks 20 hours a week just as my school board role. One of the things that we did was, yes, it's a significant amount of time commitment, in particular if you want to do the job well and you want to make sure that you're being and working in partnership with a various number of other stakeholders as well. But for our policy work, one of the things we did is we went away from having one policy meeting per month to having 2 policy meetings per month. That also made it available for people to attend. So you're more likely to attend if you have more options. And so there's no doubt it was a significant time commitment, a good deal of back and forth outside of committee meetings and outside of board meetings. But again, if we're talking about the opportunity to transform a school district and how we do the work that we do, it's probably no other time better spent.
Agreed.
Now, let's get to some content. Tell us, give us some examples of some of the higher stake, higher impact policy transformations that have emerged to date from this process. Just give us a sense of the level at which you've carried this out.
Sure.
And Doug, I'll go back to that light at the end of the tunnel. I've been reflecting on that term the last few minutes, and there is no end of the tunnel or no light from my perspective. What we're doing right now is embedding an approach to the work that we hope will be sustainable for decades to come. And as I look at the different policies, there is no one policy that's more higher stakes than another here. Each one of our policies has gone through a similar process and has elicited the same type of engagement as any other. For example, field trips, meal purchasing policies. In other districts that I've been in, that would be in a consent agenda maybe, or maybe a 5-minute conversation at the board level and you're done, and you're going on to the next policy where grading practices or the gifted and talented program would be something that the community would get riled up about and would be a higher stakes. Here, because we're looking at language and our approach to love and inclusion, every single policy is under extreme scrutiny. And, for example, with the domestic and international field trips, every school district takes field trips. But for us, in our policy, in the original policy that was last updated in the early 2000s, there was no statement about how inclusive those trips would be. And this board, and with the community support and conversation, went and added language that spoke to every young person, no matter how much money they have or what types of disabilities they have, will be included in our international and domestic field trips. And that has looked like the board putting language in the policy that speaks to we will support a young person who's medically fragile so that they are included in the field trip as much as any other young person. It looks like every young person will have an opportunity to go on any field trip irrespective of their financial background, every young person. It also has gotten down to the granular level around the makeup, the gender makeup of these field trips and the chaperones. One of the things I hope Sean speaks about a little bit later is the language has shifted even around pronouns and us being gender neutral with our pronouns on these field trips. Other policies, a meal charge, we did not have a meal charge policy. But we also, like I experienced when I was a kid, we had lunch shaming going on. If a young person, and it could be my child, and I have two in our school district, and I'm the worst at making sure their accounts are updated. If that young person were to go through a lunch line in this school district, the person in the lunch line, before these policies were revised, would stop them and say, your account is not up to date, or you're in the arrears. And the policy now has language that speaks to payment plans, how we won't ask kids in a line about that. We're going to make sure every young person has access to the same types of meal as every other person. It's not that free meal that we all haven't gotten when we didn't have money or have money on our accounts. So again, I could go on and on. Special education policies have been changed to make the language more inclusive. Pre-K, preschool, who we accept into our school district and when we accept them, and the levels in which we accept them has shifted. Again, every word has been scrutinized to make sure it's loving, inclusive, and culturally responsive. Sean, would you add something to that?
Yeah, Doc, I think that's a great, quick summary, and thank you for pushing back and making me think a little different as well, that there may not be a light to the tunnel because the idea is to make this work sustainable. So, Doug, as a quick example, almost all of our policies refer to the superintendent as he. And so when we go through, it said the superintendent or his designee. He will do this, he will do that. And we sat back thinking, like, how can we live in today's day in society, particularly our students pushing us around gender identity, and have policies that only use male pronouns? Just didn't seem to be the kind of community we wanted to create, didn't see the kind of ways in which I wanted to make my daughter or my granddaughter be living in that kind of world as well. So there's just a small example of every time we read a policy, we have a conversation about what pronouns are we using. The other thing we try to do is most policies are oftentimes written either...
Hold on there a minute.
Please.
Let me jump in. I'm sorry. So
No.
What was your solution to that? Was it he or she? Or was
Well, right now we
use he sometimes and she other times? Or how did you...
Great question. We say superintendent or designee. That's the way we got around that. It's not using pronouns at all.
Oh, okay.
And we have a number of highly intelligent folks in our school board and in our community who help us read these policies. And if we need to use a pronoun sometimes, then we'll try to figure out and we'll use his, her, or their. But oftentimes we're trying to write sentences or write language that don't need pronouns. And Doug, part of my work as someone who teaches on faculty as well is trying to think about, we don't have race pronouns. We don't have economic pronouns. We don't have ability pronouns. So you can't tell me I can't write a sentence without a gender pronoun. And so trying to push back about when are we using them and when are they more effective. Now, we also have a former English teacher on our school board who's also on the policy committee, and so we have some great debates around grammar and language. But we're really having some real conversations about what does it mean to live in a community that is truly inclusive.
Great. So basically, I think what you've said in a nutshell is they're all high stakes.
Yes,
correct.
Issues that you're addressing, and you can't really pick out one or another and say this looms above.
Sure.
So
now, we've definitely had policies that garner much more community attention, but for us, any policy we write, we know has the potential impact to land us in litigation, if I'm being real as a board member, but much more importantly has the potential to impact students. And where I was going to go next is the other thing we try to do with all of our policies is to shift the focus. Most policies are written to protect the district or protect administrators or protect teachers, and very few policies are student-centered. How can we write a policy that puts the student at the center and then writes the language from there? And that's what we've tried, I think, really hard to do over the past couple of years.
Now, I know we don't have time to get into this in much more detail, but I assume that when you craft a transformative policy, you've been describing some pretty dramatic changes, that accompanying this is a fair amount of attention to implementation. How has the implementation piece of this been handled in a nutshell?
Let me start there, Sean. Implementation
Sure.
looks like finding great leaders first. This board of education, including with my recruitment, the recruiting of me, has been very clear about what they wish to do. And they brought me in hoping that I would be more inclusive and culturally responsive and loving as a leader, and have held me accountable for making sure the team I put in place at the executive level all the way down to the classroom teacher has those same dispositions. So implementation, these policies are written for folks who love children to implement them well. These policies are also written for folks who don't love children to not find a place or be very, very uncomfortable in this organization. And that's just raw, real talk there. And that's, again, the conflict and the uncomfortable conversations occur daily because in a school district of our size, we do have folks, educators, community members who aren't committed to this type of an approach to an organization, and they become uncomfortable. So implementation starts with leadership. It starts with the board support, but again, it goes back to the policy. But the policy that's this type of inclusive and loving approach to the work we implement differently.
You know, it's interesting. One of the connections you're making is sometimes not made, and it's extraordinarily important. You're actually transforming a culture.
Absolutely.
And using policy transformation as a key tool in your tying policy to cultural change.
We've coined the term. It's culture of love. For sure.
Uniquely challenging process. Well, here's my final question, at least for this podcast,
Sure.
about this issue. Tell me what's really changed now. You're well into the process. You've made the point it really is, in a sense, continuous, never-ending. You're always going to have to be looking carefully at your stated policies. But have you seen any significant change as you've gone through this process, other than you've described word changes? But what behaviors have you seen change?
Doc, let me just give a
document.
Sure, a quick response. Our graduation rate for African American and Latino students last year was 86%. Now, I'm not saying that to rest on our laurels, because we have a goal of 100% graduation. We stopped a long time ago measuring students against students by talking about whatever the so-called achievement gap was. That any time that we don't graduate 100% of a particular population, we have work to do. But if we've gone from 53% when my child graduated in 2006 to 84% today, that is a pretty significant increase for me. And while I'm not satisfied, I think that some of the things that we've done, both via policy, via culture, via conversation, has had a real dramatic impact on that. And so some of the ways in which I feel it's different is when you talk to folks in the community. I'm also a former teacher. I taught in the school district here as well. So when I talk to my friends and colleagues, when I hear the ways in which they talk about what you had mentioned, Doug, that culture shift, some of the things we're going to see in numbers, we'll see data points increase. The other things we'll feel, if that makes sense. And in my 20 years in this community, I've been in Ithaca 20 plus years now, our schools feel different, and hopefully we're on the right path.
Yeah, and I would add, Sean was so eloquent in what he just said. The quantitative shifts I would put up against any other school district in the nation over the last 7 years. I think we've had shifts of graduation rates, enrollment patterns, discipline rates have gone down. We don't even use the word discipline anymore. Co-curricular enrollment patterns. Those quantitative shifts are absolutely remarkable. But from my perspective, what's so telling about our culture shift is that as a staff, we don't refer to percentages anymore. A graduation rate is not about 90%. It's about the 23 kids that didn't walk in 4 years. That is us. In the principal, the teachers, the superintendent, board members, knowing who the 23 kids are and their stories and how we're going to see that they graduate in 5, or there's another plan for them. Again, I can't remember the last time I spoke about a percentage in a public setting. I'm actually now telling stories and putting faces on the data, which is a significant shift in just a short amount of time. And I attribute that back to our approaches to policy and language and culture.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for telling this very, very dramatic story. I think our listeners certainly, or many of them at any rate, will see policy in a different way. You know, you get used to thinking of it as a rather dry subject, matter of mapping out process. And as you said, one of you said earlier, many policies have been dealt with as consent agenda.
Sure.
You've talked about policy as a very powerful tool for building a culture of a particular kind, inclusive, loving, and so on. I want to thank you for telling your story and taking the time this afternoon. I wish you a good afternoon, and I'm sure many people around the country are going to want to learn more about this process you've gone through. And so you take care. Any final words from either of you before we sign off?
Thank you for the opportunity to share our thinking. I appreciate it.
Well,
thanks for the opportunity and looking forward to more conversations in the future.
Well, I too, and thank you, gentlemen. Take care, and have a great rest of your week.